Everyone can hear me, perfect. All right, thank you everyone. I'm Louise, Maynard, Atem, and I will be moderating this discussion on better, stronger, faster authentication. I think I haven't been at the conference for the past couple of days, but I'm guessing the topic of more people going online, more e-commerce, and what that has meant for the industry has come up at least once, if not many more times than that. And it's an issue that we're all struggling with, definitely, of how do we ensure the most frictionless journey for our good customers when they're identifying themselves and authenticating themselves online, but how do we also make sure that we're combating as much fraud as possible? I've read a number of reports from UK Finance and others around how much fraud has increased during the time of the pandemic. So obviously, the systems that we have in place need to be improved, and that's what we are going to discuss with this esteemed set of panelists today. So instead of me trying to botch some bios on all of these people, I will let you guys introduce yourselves. Actually, I should probably introduce myself. I'm Louise Maynard Atem. I lead research at Women in Identity as part of my time, and the other part of my time, I'm the head of data insights for GBG, which is an identity verification company. So this is definitely a topic close to my heart, and I will hand over to the other panelists.
My name is Ceccotti. I'm the disputes technical lead at Monzo, so I deal a lot with the technical side of handling fraud disputes and goods and services disputes. How do we claim money back from merchants? How do we figure out fraud losses that we have to write off? And a lot of that is related to strong customer authentication to reduce that as much as possible.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Adam Butler from Transmit Security. I've been in the identity space for a fair few years now, working at Transmit to bring our Bind ID passwordless service to a number of different verticals in the UK.
Awesome, thank you. Lauren?
Thanks, Louise. I'm Lauren Jones. I'm a senior advisor at Huawei in the payment standardization and policy space, so really looking at what the industry trends are related to payments and how Huawei can support the industry of financial services and others in taking advantage of those.
Awesome. And Matt?
Afternoon, everyone. Matt Wilson, part of Ekata, based in the UK. Our headquarters are in Amsterdam. I myself have been in the fraud and identity space for about 10 years or so, kind of a mixed bag of working for credit card companies and now more on the vendor side as well.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. So as Laura mentioned, if you guys have questions, please feel free. I want this to be not super formal and quite conversational as much as we can make it in this kind of setting. But if you do have questions, hands up. Maybe don't shout out, that might be a bit disruptive. But I'm happy to take them as we go, or if people would rather wait until the end, I'll make sure that I leave at least 5 minutes so that we can address any questions in the room or any questions for people watching online. So to start with, I'll start with the question that I alluded to in my very short intro of that balance between a smooth journey for customers, but also the necessary amounts of friction that's needed to avoid fraud. So Adam, I'll come to you first around how organizations can actually strike that balance between making sure it's a good experience for me as a user, but keeping the bad guys out.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's an interesting one because I think it's fair to say that we've been really struggling with this kind of balance of how we balance customer experience with security for a good number of years now. And I think it's fair to say that a number of things have been tried to try and meet that balance. We've tried to encourage things like OTPs to try and get the security level up, and that's really not worked at all because, as most people know, OTPs are inherently insecure and open to attack. We tried things like utilizing social login, which again is great for customer experience, makes it really smooth, but again, really falls down on security. And lots of different things have been tried, and I think it's fair to say that where we are today is we've got a situation where there is no balance between customer experience and security. We're either going heavy on security at the degradation of customer experience or going heavy on customer experience at the degradation of security. So I think, luckily, the future is looking a little different now because the standards have been around for a little while. The manufacturers of things like smartphones are starting to support those standards, which will enable, hopefully, a far better future, both from a customer's perspective, but also from an organization's viewpoint as well.
Okay. And seeing lots of nods on the panel here, so anyone want to add on to any of that?
Yeah, I think a point I always kind of make is that technology is driven on the customer experience, a good thing, again, I think going back to your point, but actually technology is driven us to demand more a lot in every experience that we have online. But the issue with technology is that advances are great from a customer experience point of view, but a fraudster then gets hold of that technology as well and goes down the other route, and we're almost kind of always having this kind of cat and mouse battle in that side of things. So yeah, I think for me, I think technology is at the forefront of being able to make customer experience better for everyone, but it could be our pitfall as well longer term from a fraud point of view. So we'll see how that one goes.
Absolutely. And I suppose if I think about a digital-only challenger bank and how important authentication is for you, given you don't have a physical presence, how has sort of this journey been within Monzo, and what does authentication look like for you, and how are you balancing this sort of trade-off between friction and customer journeys?
Yeah, at Monzo we are a mobile-first bank, so in order for you to bank with Monzo, you have to have the app installed on your phone. So in a way, we really we can take advantage of this a lot more than a lot of the incumbent banks. So our SEA experience, at least for e-commerce payments, is the possession of your mobile phone, and then either biometrics via face identification or your fingerprints, or knowledge, which is your PIN. And that works out really well because our demographics tends to be quite tech savvy. They will have their phones with them most of the time in order to bank as well, and they tend to not stumble so much upon the issues of authenticating. But like the both of you were saying about security being sometimes a blocker to frictionless experience, I also want to mention that I guess fraudsters are always up to date with whatever security measures you have. So for example, we're phasing out SMS OTP as a form of strong customer authentication because it doesn't actually meet both the factors. If a fraudster takes your phone, you receive an SMS message with a code, well, they can easily get that via the notification, or even unlocking your phone, which may or may not have a password. So we're always trying to catch up with the latest of, I guess, what fraudsters are looking into, and it's a really, really hard challenge to catch up to speed with that. And a bit more about the balance of frictionless and challenging customers. Across the industry, there's a 20% abandonment rate when you requested strong customer authentication on an online payment, which means for some merchants that could be literally 20% of your revenue gone because of one regulation. At Monzo, we brought that down to 5%, which is 1 in every 20 customers, especially because of that, and a lot of improvements to customer experience. But there's like a graph, a line where you try to figure out, can we challenge customers too much? Can we provide more frictionless? Because if we provide more frictionless experience, we're taking a lot of fraud loss, which we don't want. But if we challenge everything, then we're losing customers through abandonment. So it's almost like a lot of our work is trying to find that perfect balance, the peak where fraud losses are low, but also customer abandonment is low.
That's kind of like the holy grail situation, isn't it? I'm
really
sure we all
hard.
want to figure out exactly how we do that.
Yeah.
And Lauren, if I come to you then, around obviously working for Huawei, focusing maybe a little bit more on the hardware security side of things, how do you think that might be able to help support some of the requirements that we've talked around PSD2?
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting to look at the hardware side of the equation, because we often talk about software and app security and that side of the business. But, I mean, in short, yes, hardware, obviously, and hardware security can support the industry. Obviously, from the possession side of things, you're in possession of a smart device when you're engaging with mobile financial services these days. But I think also the fact that hardware can support the security of the other authentication elements. So biometrics, for example, you can rely on the trusted execution environment of a smart device to better protect biometrics, for example, or other trusted applications. So I think we're still at the start of the journey to understand how hardware can support the financial services industry and some of its security requirements. The two sides of the coin haven't necessarily worked very well collaboratively together in the past, but I think there's a lot of scope for that. Particularly in the standard space, we're looking at things like Global Platform, which have, heavily standardized around hardware security, but also now things like FIDO Alliance, which are how do you engage in an online transaction whilst making that authentication experience much smoother, maybe by going back to a device. So I think there's a lot of work happening, but we're still on the start of that journey of collaboration between smart device manufacturers, and it's not necessarily just smartphone manufacturers, it's the kind of broader IoT market, and the financial services industry. And kind of not to labour the point, but I mean, I think what's something that's also really interesting to observe is, and I've heard a lot about it at the conference and obviously other conferences, is we always talk about hyper-personalisation now. You know, open data is going to make, you know, customers have much more tailored experiences, but we never really discuss security as one of those areas that could be personalized. And, you know, by using kind of native cryptography or security of a device, you can enable much more personalized security experiences. Because what I might feel is secure might not be what you feel is secure or what Arthur feels is secure. And I think, you know, the understanding of that and the appreciation of that will enable things like financial inclusion a little bit better, but also enable other customers to feel like they have a security experience that is right for them, obviously whilst being compliant with PSD2 and whatnot. So I think the two sides of the equation, the manufacturing side and the kind of financial services side, should be looking to work closer together on these areas.
I think that's really interesting. I don't think I've come across sort of the idea of personalized security. Like you say, we often think about, you know, the right offers for you or the recommendations of what next best action you're going to take. But applying that to the security lens is really interesting. So taking some notes, take that one away with me.
Well, I mean, just to kind of like, you know, you think about it for a smartwatch, you know, doing a PIN or a kind of facial recognition, for example, is not a great user experience for that particular context or for that particular device. And the same when you look at, you know, your smart fridge or, you know, your smart printer, you want it to reorder cartridges, you know, that the kind of traditional ways that we authenticate might not necessarily be right for that experience. So having a kind of personalized experience for a particular device or a particular scenario is, I think, something that we're just at the start of exploring.
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Do you think that exposes risk to a certain degree, though? That would be my question, because if you're almost giving the customer so much control to say that you choose how you tell us, or sorry, you choose how you authenticate. I'm not a fraudster, but I'm putting my fraudster hat on here and thinking, well, that sounds great to me because I'm now going to choose how I present myself to you.
But I mean, I see where you're coming from with that. But I mean, in terms of those security credentials, like I know for most financial services providers, it's okay. Well, you get what you're given. You have an OTP SMS, that's the way you're going to authenticate, or you have a biometric credential or a PIN number. You don't necessarily have a choice of the range of those different credentials, like a PIN or a biometric, or, you know, it's one or the other. So I think it's not necessarily heightening the risk because those credentials are already out there in the wild now. They just don't have a choice over which one you want to use as a customer. Would be my kind of philosophy. I mean, risk obviously is one of those areas that is, you know, a key kind of theme.
Okay, makes sense. I mean, given you're right, we utilize all sorts of different types of tech. I mean, I'm sitting here with at least 3 pieces of tech on me right now on the stage. But I mean, there's probably only one of them that I could use to access financial services, maybe 2 if you include the iPad. But I suppose, opening up that level of choice to people, being able to authenticate in a way that is most convenient for them, would actually potentially drive improved security. We don't know. But you mentioned something around data, and so obviously I'm going to come to you, Matt, around how you're thinking of sort of how we use data at the point of onboarding and actually right the way through the customer journey to try and reduce the onus on the customer to do the authenticating, and how we can do some checks using data in the background to drive that smoother process.
Yeah, I think, so going back to some of the surveys that we did a survey of about 9,000 customers, and they all kind of said that they want everything, 80% of customers said they want an instant decision on everything that they do when they interact with their bank, with their retailer, etc. So for us, data is at the forefront of that, because data really sits in the background. They don't know what data is being transferred half the time, but they still want that customer experience that comes with it, right? So they just see the nice shiny website and they think this is fantastic. For us, we kind of talk about data at the earliest point in the customer journey and kind of thinking about how by getting that data at the earliest point, you can understand the risk of that individual or even the trustworthiness of that individual at the earliest stage. So, you know, in our world, 98% of interactions that we have are good transactions. Yeah. So those good customers shouldn't be getting painted with the same brush as your fraudster or your dispute individual, whatever it might be, because actually they just want to go about their business and ultimately spend money with you guys in the room, right? So we always sort of talk towards getting that data at the earliest stage, using it to your advantage, and actually almost filtering your customers in one way or the other to say, well, let's choose a risk-based authentication approach and say, this customer looks good to us, let's give him the most optimum experience. This one's in the middle, we might need to put a bit of friction in front of that person because we're not 100% sure who they are. And the final one is obviously your fraudster, right? So get them out the front door at the earliest point. Don't bother authenticating too much with them because you know they're fraudsters anyway. That's kind of our steer on that world.
Yeah, that makes sense. And can you talk a little bit more about the sorts of data that you use to split people into those different categories of the good versus the definitely not?
Yeah, so we look at primarily personally identifiable information, so the name, email, phone, IP address, and physical address of an individual. And we have a network of about 2,000 customers worldwide that kind of feed that data into our system, right? So we learn from interactions. We start to see what good looks like, what bad looks like, and sometimes we are in the middle somewhere as well. I won't say we're always black and white, but yeah, we use those data points to our advantage. And are able to kind of understand the relationships between them, because as you say, you're probably carrying your phone today, but generally people use the same mobile number, the same email address, etc. When they're interacting online. As soon as those variances come into play and you start to see changes to those details, that's when the security needs to go up and you need to be incorporating different experiences.
Yeah.
And I think you talk a lot about the data in terms of deciding whether to challenge a customer or not based on fraud models. But I think there's data that you can leverage across the entire journey. So if you're going to challenge a customer, maybe do some A/B testing to have it in a specific format in the app, maybe up at the top right or in the middle. Work with the merchants to figure out if you can, I guess, do more data analysis on them and potentially even have a higher challenge rate based on chargeback rates for a specific merchant. So yeah, maybe we sometimes look too much into the fraud model, but there's a lot on the whole end-to-end and the customer experience and user experience. So we do a lot of A/B testing at Monzo. If you have the app installed on your phone and you compare it with one of your friends, it might turn out to be completely different, and you're being used for that. But then we iterate and we end up finding a great solution purely based on like the data that we collected on customers.
I think the point you raised around your ability to share amongst the 2,000 different customers that you have, because one thing I've always toyed with is that, fraudsters share their MOs. They share a lot faster than probably the good guys do. So I think leveraging that kind of consortium model of insights that you get from multiple merchants, multiple customers, multiple different industries can only be a good thing in terms of helping us keep pace with the level of sharing that, the not so good actors are doing. But unless does anyone want to come back on any of that before I jump into it? No, okay. So we talk a lot about fraud, obviously, and rightly so, part of the big reason why we're all here, and how the failure of authentication can link into that. But I suppose there's other implications that you've already started to allude to, Arthur, around if we don't get authentication right. So maybe from a payments perspective, you can give us a bit of a comment on that, and maybe then come to you, Lauren.
Of course. So like I mentioned, across the industry, 20% of payments are abandoned. We really need to understand what those 20% are. So 20% of payments are abandoned, but we know that around 1 in every 1,000, 1,500 payments are actually disputed for fraud.
Right.
Which means if our models were perfect at detecting fraud, 0.1% of payments should be abandoned. So there's a massive gap there. So why are we failing authentication? What happens if a customer gets stuck? They simply don't have the phone with them, and they have to buy a flight to leave their country immediately. Or vulnerable customers who might not so easily go through the SEA experience as everyone else. So we really have to find ways to make it such that it is possible for customers who don't really get that journey or don't really have the possibility of going through that journey. Can we go through chat? Can they do two-factor authentication by saying their mother's maiden name and we know their device? So I guess finding those two-factor authentications in any other way. And really understand why that abandonment is there, not just for the better customer experience, but to make sure that that minority is also accounted for. And I'm sure that will be talked about in the diversity conversation later on.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the single biggest implication for me is the erosion of trust. I mean, if you get authentication wrong, or a customer can't trust the authentication process or the broader security of the financial service provider, whether that's a bank or otherwise, the trust is lost, and it's very difficult to regain that. And as trust is kind of eroded, I think the question then becomes, can you even keep my money safe? Which is primarily why people open a bank account or have a financial services provider, is to keep their money safe and not have cash under the mattress. And if you're not delivering on that, then I think it's going to be much harder for you to attract new customers. But I think trust also then trickles down into profitability, because the customers want to have more products from you, and also they're more likely to take on board new innovations that you might choose to roll out. So kind of implicitly through that, I think if trust is eroded, it's harder to kind of drive that innovation wave, because customers don't want to try new things or to adopt new technologies, because fundamentally underneath all of that, the trust is not there in what you're providing. So I mean, I think there's broad implications of just, the fraudulent side, which obviously, particularly coming out of COVID, is a huge, huge issue. But also the kind of trust in the fundamental financial system itself is at risk with that.
That's really... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And I guess we talk about fail of authentication in terms of potentially a customer being stuck to authenticate. But there's also the other end of a customer might genuinely authenticate because they've been scammed, because they've been coerced. So even if we were to challenge absolutely everyone, you still have to educate your customers, you still have to add warnings and make sure that even if they do authenticate, they actually mean it, they know what they're doing. Yeah. I guess it's simple to look at the abandonment and errors as being the actual big issue here, but that's another massive issue on the side.
Fair. And coming back to your point around trust, I suppose the question that comes to me is, how do we, and I have no idea of the answer of this, just FYI, how do we actually codify trust? So with my GBG hat on, I think of from a data perspective, there are things that we could align that would suggest, oh yes, this is this person or this isn't this person. But do anyone on the panel have any thoughts on how we actually go about codifying that trust within the authentication systems and beyond? Through random curveball in there. I like to do that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective on the concept of trust, we're at Transmit Security, we're quite clear that consumers should have control over being able to transfer trust, for example, between their devices. And a good example of that is recently I've upgraded my iPhone, and I sat the new iPhone next to the old iPhone, and everything transferred across what I thought really seamlessly and quickly, which was fantastic. However, when I opened up my banking app, it was like the first time I had ever dealt with that bank, despite being a customer for 20 odd years. So the concept of being able to take a trusted device like a mobile phone, a laptop, a desktop, and transfer that trust between devices as a consumer is really appealing, because I don't want to go through a whole new onboarding process when I'm an existing customer. So I think that kind of angle of trust is quite an important one, because consumers shouldn't be treated like there's no trust there that exists if they're an existing customer.
Having been through that process, I know exactly what you mean.
Equally, I think if I'm changing device, I'd still want that minimal bit of friction there.
Exactly.
Yes,
absolutely.
If I'm changing, basically our whole lives are on our phone these days. I know it's a sad reality, but it is. But if I'm changing phone, I want someone to know that I've changed phone. If that makes sense. I want them to say, "Hang on, Matt, you don't normally use that phone. Why have you changed?"
There has to be a process in place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, interesting. Coming back to you then, Adam, we've talked about sort of the process being kind of broken, two-factor not being the best, OTP being very, very insecure. We've bemoaned, I'm sure all of us in this room, bemoaned passwords any number of times, and all of the different steps that you have to go through, the knowledge-based questions where you just forgot the answer. What are the alternatives if none of this is currently working?
Yeah, so I think, fortunately you're in a place now where, smartphones have been widely adopted in the general population. The standards have been around for some time now, which enable the on-device authentication utilizing the biometrics. So we shouldn't be relying on factors around something that people know. It should be around something people have, a possession factor, their device, and then something people are, which is their biometrics, which are inherently more secure than a password or a knowledge-based piece of information. But once you've got that concept within the smartphone and the authentication process being much more seamless, utilizing the biometrics, removing the credentials, they should be removed from every single part of the customer journey. So when you're onboarding a customer, when you're asking them to log in, when you're asking them to recover their account, when they're getting a new device, we shouldn't be falling back on secret words, passcodes, PIN numbers. And when they then call into the contact center, they shouldn't be going through this kind of, what's your name, what's your date of birth, your first line of your address, your mother's maiden name, your dog's name, your friend's cat's name, etc., 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 for what feels like forever. And it still doesn't feel like I'm being properly authenticated. So, these authentication processes, which are available now to utilize, should be utilized across all channels, across all devices, whichever customer touch points your customer wants to interact with. So from our perspective, that is really, really important going forward. It should be passwordless native. You're taking away credentials. We're able to do that now, and we're able to do it across every channel.
And do you think that presents any additional kind of risk? So obviously, passwords change, can be hacked, all of that. But I mean, if your biometric data gets stolen, I mean, you can't change it. So how do you balance the risk that presents with the utility that it presents?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's undoubtedly risk in absolutely everything that you do. And I think it's important, so if you're dealing with biometrics, not to take the biometrics off of the device, because then you're encouraging an extra aspect of risk. So by utilizing and leaving the biometrics on the device and utilizing the standards that are there, you're getting around that particular aspect of risk. But I think if you look at the aspect of passwords and the amount of problems they cause for businesses, I just think that there is so much risk attached to those today, with people having so many online accounts. I think the last time I checked, I had well over 300, sadly, and even more embarrassing was the fact that most of those had the same password. So, we're in a bad situation. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people didn't have the number of online accounts that they have today. So I just think by removing those credentials, you are taking away such a massive element of risk, not just for the consumer, but for the business. The point of data breach, 9 times out of 10 is credential-based. By taking that big chunk of risk away, you're never going to be able to take every element of risk, but you are taking a major percentage away.
That makes sense.
And just to kind of chime in on that, Adam, I think I totally agree with you, and I think passwords and OTP, SMS, and all that kind of stuff is not what we should be aspiring to. The biometric side of things are there. The kind of statistic about it's like 1 in 64 million chance that someone has a similar fingerprint to you is pretty good in my book when you compare it to kind of the risk of passwords. But it's then how do we protect that biometric stuff? And back to the kind of hardware security, that's where the kind of two sides of the coin can kind of come together and work together. But I also think, financial services, we're still at the very beginning of the biometric journey. I mean, you look at law enforcement, it's been using it for years, but they don't have to use it in real-time decision-making. They have a certain period of time. They can go and check that the criminal is the suspected criminal is who they suspect that it is, and all that kind of stuff, and they have a period of time that they can go and do some analysis on that. In financial services, we need to have that decision in real time, and biometrics can help with that, and there's a lot of research going into biometrics and the future of biometrics, and financial services has been primarily focused on face and fingerprint, but there are so many more other biometric elements that we could be using, like gait, like haptics, like heart rate, that we should be looking at analysing a bit more through the context of obviously the risk and fraud. But one area that, Huawei's involved in, but it's being led by a university in Canada, is the kind of conversation around continuous authentication, where you're constantly collecting data on the customer or the user to kind of build a picture of what regular behaviour looks like for that particular person, and having a blueprint for them. So you're always kind of continuously authenticating them. I think that's the kind of what we should be aspiring to, not the kind of OTP side of things and passwords, but obviously, then you layer in the privacy side of things and it becomes challenging. But I think there's a lot more that we can be aspiring to than we currently are.
I love the idea of making a payment with a smartphone, where possession is a smartphone and adherence is my heartbeat. It feels completely frictionless to the customer making that payment, but in reality, we've still met both factors of authentication.
And there's a lot of research being done on that, but I think the financial services industry is kind of one step removed from that research, which is a shame because they have some of the biggest challenges, but also can be one of the biggest beneficiaries of what is happening in that space. So I think there's a lot closer alignment there. You also look at sorry to kind of like badger on that, but like the kind of multi-biometric models as well, where you use multiple biometric elements rather than, rather than inherence plus possession. It's kind of all inherence, but different types.
No, I definitely agree, and I think so often we are thinking of the one modality that we log into our phones with, and generally just that one. But you're right. There's so many different kinds of biometrics, and if we can start to do more and incorporate more of those, inherently you feel like the security goes up. The risk does too, and we could probably have a whole other conversation around the privacy of of what we're talking about, but we won't get into that just now. Arthur, I don't know if there's more that you wanted to add around the things that Monzo in particular are doing. You said they're stepping away from things like OTP for the reasons that we've discussed. Are there other things that you're introducing into your customer journeys that you can share with us?
We're reevaluating our fraud models a lot to figure out exactly that balance of over-challenging and under-challenging customers. We're also looking into a few projects I can't share too many details on, but about taking advantage of the fact that we will challenge the customer, and on that screen being able to make an offering or make changes to how they pay. So it's not so much, it's almost like taking advantage of the fact that we are now calling the customer for attention and say, hey, we have a new proposition for you. And the other thing about over-challenging customers as well is that sometimes you might do it to prove to themselves that they are the ones making the payment. So to stop things like first-party fraud. If you shop at a cryptocurrency exchange, we know pretty certainly it is you, but which chances are we still want to challenge you, because when you go and dispute that payment later on, we say, well, you went through two-factor authentication here. We unfortunately cannot give you the money back for that investment. Some of the things we're looking into are quite interesting.
Okay, makes sense. And Matt, I'll come to you around, so we've talked quite a bit about biometrics and things, and obviously you've talked about how data in the background can help support any of these journeys. Does a lot of the new modalities around biometrics, is that going to influence kind of the Ekata model and how you guys are authenticating in the background, or will that not necessarily come into it?
I don't think so. I think we always talk about being used in conjunction with multiple other technologies that's out there and in the market. So I think for us, we fit a little bit earlier, as I said earlier, that very kind of start of a customer journey. Yeah. And I think if you think about the actual statistics, and I'm sure Arthur probably has more on this than I do, but the biggest risk you have with a customer is generally when they're brand new to you, because you know very little about them. Yeah. Right? So that's that first short period of time. It's so important to actually say, look, we can trust this person, and then start going into the biometric conversations, because you don't want to give that experience to someone that's managed to get around your fraud controls or your risk controls, because they're learning from all of that, right? So they're now in your bank or in your retail company, whatever it might be, and they're now learning what you're doing to make their experience easier. So we talk about understanding that risk at the earliest point, which is why we kind of work hand in hand with biometric companies. We don't see them kicking us out just yet.
Okay. A good synergy. All right. So I appreciate I've been doing all of the question asking, so I'll ask one more and then we can open it out. So my usual future focused final question of the year is 2050, or when some suitable time in the future. What is each of your predictions for what the authentication process look like? Feel free to use various bits of information that have already been discussed through people on the panel. I will start. You're right next to me, Arthur, I'm afraid, so I'm going to have to start with you.
Damn it. I'm really banking on open finance. And it'd be interesting if we could go through an authentication experience where, like Adam mentioned, not only are you carrying that information across different devices, but you even could be carrying that information across different financial institutions, right? So instead of having to go and prove your identity every time, do your biometrics every time, if we can have this ecosystem where you own your data and you allow banks to share that information with each other, not just banks, maybe mortgage provider, maybe insurance, whatever. For the purpose of strong customer authentication, can we make that experience seamless solely for the fact that we know everything about you on day one? That's where I'd like to see the next few decades.
Okay, cool. On to you next one.
So I'd say I'd bring it forward a little bit and say not 2050, maybe 2023, 2025.
Okay.
I'd want three things. So I'd want the dreaded credentials taken away, but not just taken away from when I log in, but from the entire customer journey. So onboarding, registration, through to login, through to account recovery. And I'd want that same authentication experience when I'm interacting through my smartphone, my desktop, when I'm ringing a contact center, when I'm going in branch, that same level of authentication should apply throughout those different customer touchpoints. And the final thing is, if once I get a new device, I want that same kind of concept of being able to transfer my trust between my known devices with the new device, so that I don't have to go through a really clunky onboarding process for as a customer.
Okay. Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two kind of things for me. Is a more embedded security experience. We talk about embedded finance all the time, but we kind of avoid bringing security into that conversation because it's too difficult, and you know, a lot of disparate actors in that space. But I think, yeah, having a more embedded security experience that is built on context and a bigger, you know, to Arthur's point, a bigger understanding of you as a customer to support continuous authentication. I think the drive towards IoT and open data, not just open banking or open finance, but open data, will really help to build that kind of footprint. And then also the kind of choice element that I mentioned at the beginning, where we empower consumers to be able to make the security, or use the security methods that are right for them, whilst obviously still being compliant with the regulation, but giving them more power to make the security decisions that are right.
Makes sense. And finally, Matt?
I started thinking about flying cars. These are
So did I. That's where my mind went.
I want to
It's less about what will happen, more about what I want to happen. So sorry for that.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I've got an 8-month-old baby, and I kind of look at him, and he's like already using my phone or trying to grab my phone and use it to interact already, and it kind of scares me what that looks like. But I know Zuckerberg as well is talking about this meta world and all of that what's coming. So we'll probably all be robots by that point anyway. But for me, I think like the biggest thing that I think we should all expect in our lives is just those buzzwords, which is frictionless, seamless, and customer experience being at the forefront of everything we do. I mean, like every experience I take part in now, if anything takes longer than about 5 seconds on my phone, I will go somewhere else. So I think every customer or company thinks about that now. Every vendor thinks about that, trying to make that at the forefront of their new products. So yeah, the future is fast, I would say. That would be my answer.
What I heard from that is that we should build a fraud model to stop your children from making payments on your phone.
Yeah.
So even if we
I'm
know the
worried what
risk,
he's going to start buying.
even if we know the risk is really low, we should be able to detect that it's not you.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Awesome, okay, and hat tip for getting metaverse into the conversation. I thought we were going to get through the whole session with no mention of meta, but...
Yeah. I mean, I don't really understand it. So
nor do I,
shouldn't
to
have
be
said
totally
anything.
honest.
Yeah.
Is it a bet? Try and get it in there.
Yeah.
Good work, in the dying moments. Okay, those are all of my questions, so I would open it out to the floor if anyone has any questions in here, or to those folks watching online if they have any questions for our panelists. And please don't all shout at once, and don't make them about meta, because we're not the right people to talk.
There's one down the front,
Oh, okay.
just coming to
see
give you the mic.
We'd happily engage in a Peloton discussion as well.
Absolutely, find us later. We can talk about that.
What are your, sort of, if any, thoughts or ideas on how to protect people? So if biometrics are the future of security, how do you imagine protecting people in more vulnerable situations? For instance, say someone was in a relationship with someone who had a gambling addiction or a domestic abuse case. How do you stop them from using their biometrics whilst they're asleep? Or
Who would like to take that? I'm not going to pick on anyone because that's a challenging question.
I mean, I'll have a go.
Okay, phew, get on one.
Great question.
Yeah, so I think, you know, that's a really difficult one. And obviously, with any solution, you absolutely have to look across all sectors of society. And I think particularly with, I mean, we're coming at it from the angle of you've got to remove credentials because credentials are bad. And if you look at certain sections of society, particularly the elderly, particularly those with difficulties around memory recall, why in this day and age are we asking those sections to rely on words and numbers and names and passwords and things? So I absolutely take your point. It's a very, very difficult one to answer, particularly around biometrics, and particularly the scenario that you've put in there. I guess the only thing that you would look to do, particularly from our perspective, would be to build in a solution which, and I know there are lots out there, but take into account things like behavioural analytics, where you know if someone has unlocked the phone, if they're that person. So they might well have the code or the biometrics to unlock it, but you can tell whether it's that person that should be using the phone that is using the phone. And that's how you can, with kind of risk analysis, make that decision that, yeah, it's right to let that person in, or hang on a second, we should maybe step up and perform some other piece of authentication.
And that kind of ties with the continuous authentication model where you're building up a blueprint of regular activity of a user. So, you know, if you have that blueprint, you know that that person doesn't generally go on gambling websites or, you know, uses sites such as that. So you can then kind of put in the right defense mechanisms to counter that. I think that the domestic violence is probably a bit more of a tricky issue. But yeah, building up a kind of, like I say, a blueprint of what the user is expected to be doing and the type of payments they are expected to be making so that you can identify kind of potential fraudulent or misuse. But I think we're probably a way off that, yeah. But the kind of financial inclusion element is also really important because we talk about biometrics a lot, but actually, like for the elderly, fingerprints are really, really hard because there's not, you know, a lot of blood circulation at the end of your fingertip. So actually, biometric for the elderly is not a great solution. So what else can we use that supports that particular section of users?
I think that's key. I think it's having the alternatives. I think, you know, well, there's going to be 80% of people that can go down one path, and that's fine, but we need to have the alternatives for the people that don't fit into that happy path, as we call it, and just to make sure that everybody can get to the same endpoint, but not necessarily through the same means. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any questions?
No? Okay. Any questions from online that we could try and answer as well? Okay, well, in that case, I will thank you all so much for your time. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm going to go and figure out how to do continuous authentication after this, because I think that is absolutely the way forward. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I think we'll all be around afterwards if there are any follow-up conversations that anybody wants to have. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.